I'm going to do that right now.
All right.
That's great.
So just a reminder, everyone, we are recording this session. All right, Nikki. So I'm authorized to start.
Yes, you are. Thank you, Joe.
Fantabulous. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joe Dinunzio. I'm the Executive Director of the Mike and Renee Child Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Welcome to our Big Bang workshop. This is the third in our series. Looking forward to sharing some information for you. So in a moment, I'm going to share my screen. I've got a framework I'm going to walk you through. A couple of ground rules. The first is please feel free to ask questions. You can drop them into chat while I'm talking, and Nikki will keep me alerted to those. We can address them as we're going. And then we've left time at the end for questions as well. And then I will stay on the line post 1 o'clock for folks that want to have a one-on-one conversation. Nikki and I will be available as well. Nikki, maybe you can take a moment to introduce yourself. And I see Joanna and Jasmine are on. They can introduce themselves, and then I'll start.
Sounds great. Hi, everyone. My name is Nikki Peterson. I'm the Senior Program Manager at the Mike and Renee Child Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Really glad to see you today. We're excited about the Big Bang this year.
Great. Joanna?
Hi, everyone. Joanna Siebert, the Associate Director of the Mike and Renee Child Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. It's wonderful to see everybody here today. Thank you.
Great. And Jasmine?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine Theo, and I'm an event specialist here at the Institute. I'm very excited for today's session.
Awesome. Fantastic. All right, so we're going to jump right in and start. So really our focus here, we use in a curriculum at our entrepreneurship academies, at our workshops, the teaching curriculum base that we use. We try to use a consistent thread. So what you're going to see is sort of an extraordinarily condensed version of a couple of things. So first off, we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes to commit to move forward with your idea. So I know many, if not all of you, are contemplating participating in the Little Bang and or the Big Bang, and really thinking about an idea, a concept, a technology that you want to move forward. So we're going to talk a little bit about commitment. We're going to ask you to think about a new venture as a series of experiments. We're going to kind of talk at a high level about what does that mean. And this will really tee up our session next week on validation, where we'll talk about some of the specific efforts you need to validate the market, the business, and the technology. Then we're going to talk briefly about the idea that your first deliverable is a pitch, and talk about 3 different types of pitches and how you think about them and your ability to tell your story and the story of your company. And then we're going to shift gears, and the second part of our conversation will be about problem, solution, and value proposition, starting most importantly with being able to understand and articulate the problem that you're going to solve. All right? So we've got 2 poll questions that we want to start with. Always good to have an interaction. So I'm going to pull up that screen in a moment. I'm going to leave this up for a moment. You can go to pollev.com and then enter UC Davis, or you can scan with your mobile device this QR code. I'll leave it up for just a moment. Okay. And now I am going to do, even though I'm supposed to be able to share different screens, I'm going to close that share and open a new share because I find that it works better. So here is our first question. What 21st century innovation has had a major impact on your life? So you can scan the QR code in the right corner, or you can go to pollev.com, UC Davis. What 21st century innovation has had a major impact on your life? And you can answer this more than once. TikTok. Yeah, and that's been quite the week, hasn't it, for TikTok? Smartphone, mobile, internet, What 21st century innovation has had a major impact on your life? Chat GPT, air fryer, you gotta eat, right? Chat GPT, absolutely. And again, you can answer more than once. What 21st century innovation has had a major impact on your life? Y'all, one more moment. Electric vehicle, absolutely, right? And so as you think about this, given we only have an hour, normally I would do a dialogue about this, right? And talk about why did it have impact and what do you think the process to get there and who is the core customer, right? And I want you to be thinking about that, right? You think about these innovations and, what was the origin story around them? How did they build commitment? How did it ultimately get into position to be able to serve you and be one of the innovations from this century that you feel has the most impact on your life? Smart appliances, absolutely. I just got notification from my dryer that it is finished drying. I feel good about that. All right, so I'm going to go back to sharing our presentation now. Okay, so, and we'll do one more poll a little bit later on. Okay, so one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is the idea that you're focused on any good, right? None of us want to work on something that's going to end up proving fruitless. And we talk a lot in the innovation and entrepreneurship space about the importance of failure and recognizing if you're not stretching, not reaching, failure is, failure is inevitable, right? And so if you're not achieving failure, you're probably not pushing yourself. None of us want to fail, right? The important thing is thinking about how failure is a productive tool, right? How it actually helps move you forward as opposed to just being a cul-de-sac. So it's sort of fundamental, area you really, really want to think about, is the idea any good? And so the vertical axis of this very simple 2x2 chart, right, is the idea looks bad to looks good, right? And the horizontal axis is the idea actually is bad to the left or good, right? And so as you think about, I'm a former and future and always management consultant, we try to reduce things to 2x2 matrices, which is an oversimplification. But at its core, if you think about that, right? If the idea looks good and is good, win. Everybody's a genius, right? Everybody's rich and everybody's happy and it's all great, right? Conversely, it's a duh. If it looks bad and it is bad, well, it's bad, right? The challenges you face in thinking about is an idea any good, right? Are the idea looks good, but it actually turns out to be not so good, right? You're investing time and energy in a bad idea that looked good at first glance, right? And then conversely, the type 2 errors down on the bottom right? You reject a good idea because it looked bad at first glance, when it turns out somebody else takes it and runs with it and is incredibly successful with it, right? So this top left is what we call the inventor's curse, right? We've all heard the stories of, inventor Fred, who went through 10 years and all these people telling him it was a really bad idea and, but eventually was able to raise the money and make it and et cetera, right? And so we have this sort of romanticized version of, well, you just keep pushing forward, even if the idea looks bad, right? And if you're really passionate about an idea, often you can get into that world. Right. The second is, and I do teach MBAs, so I've certainly seen this before, right? The MBA's curse, which is there's always 1,000 ways to look at an idea and say that's never gonna work, right? And it's it's a really critical danger where we reject something because of a sort of over an analytical or a set of assumptions, that ultimately we should have moved forward with. So I'm going to talk about 3 basic principles here. And again, we're covering ground in 45 minutes that we typically take half a day or more for, right? So I want to interject these ideas to you, and then, we'll talk a little bit about their importance, right? So the first is to move forward with your idea. It means reducing your uncertainty, right? We all struggle with, is this worth it, right? Are we in that top right of, it looks good, is good, right? Or are we in that bottom left? Right? So moving forward means reducing your uncertainty. And this idea that we want you to think about is your ability to create commitment, right? Is driven by your vision. What it is that you're trying to accomplish with your idea? What impact do you want to have on the world? And then validating that. Okay, so we have a super simple graphic here, right? The vertical axis is the current worth of the idea. And I want to be careful. We're not talking about how much would a venture capitalist say your company is worth, but the sort of inherent value in the company, right? And then the horizontal axis is development of the idea over time, right? So that's your time scale. And typically we think about this process of increasing worth over time as being a linear function, whether it's linear like this or curvilinear, right? There's some sort of function where, we move from an idea that has modest worth early on to one that over time has significant worth. The reality is value tends to increase in chunks, right? In a step function. And the reason for that is because we're reducing uncertainty. So each time we reduce uncertainty, right, in the idea, the value goes up. A simple example, early on, would anybody like my cool little cow? Is this something would demand? Would people pay for this, right? A first early experiment where we learn, yeah, there actually are some people interested in that, reduces that uncertainty, helps us build our commitment, and ultimately increases the value of our idea in our company. So as we think about this process at its highest level, the challenge we face as entrepreneurs is this think and do cycle, right? What's the uncertainty we have? Anybody want a cool little squeezy cow, right? And then what are we going to do to demonstrate, what experiment we're going to do to demonstrate whether that's right or wrong? So as you think about this commitment, your vision, right? What it is you're trying to accomplish, and validation, and this idea that value increases in a step function as your uncertainty is decreased. What you're really doing is a series of think, do experiments. What's my uncertainty? What experiment do I need to conduct to assess that? What have I learned from that? And how do I do it over and over again? And we're going to introduce throughout all of our workshops this idea of iteration, right? Your idea is constantly being iterated, right? And you're constantly learning more. And collaboration with your fellow entrepreneurs, collaboration with your potential customers, potential partners, potential employees, potential inventors, right? It's the idea of creating a virtuous collaboration and iteration cycle built around this think and do is how you move forward with your idea, right? So the second principle that we want to share is this idea that a new venture is a series of experiments, right? So we often think about a new venture as we're going to build a team, we're going to raise money, we're going to actually build our product, we're going to get it out into the marketplace. And that's one way to look at it, right? That's one framing. But we're going to ask you to take a step back at a top-down view and think of a new venture in that think-do cycle as a series of experiments, right? So as you think about managing the new venture process, right, this challenge again of think, what is it? What's my uncertainty? What experiment do I need to do to address that uncertainty? And the do, now what am I going to do, right? Your first goal is to identify and resolve these critical uncertainties quickly and cheaply. I want to stop on this because I think a lot of times they think, well, we want to raise a lot of money, right? And we want to build this thing and want to do these big experiments and everything, right? And I think often we have this framework of thinking about building a really big approach to solving the uncertainties and addressing the problems we may experience. What we encourage you to do is think about how do you identify those critical uncertainties and then resolve them quickly and cheaply, right? The less you spend, the quicker you get to understanding that 2x2 of, is this idea, does it look good, and is it good? The quicker and cheaper you can do that, the better for all concerned, right? I know a number of you work in labs, you work on things over multiple years, right? The sooner you can understand what I'm working on, does it have a path to commercialization, the better, right? I think especially when I was a young entrepreneur, I thought about, life spreads out timelessly, right? It just, it's like, it seems like life is very long, and it is, right? But as you sort of go through the process, you realize, every day, every week, every month is precious, right? things do take time to evolve and develop, right? And launching a company and making an idea real requires a significant investment of effort and time. The reality is that the sooner you can understand, is this really worth pursuing or not? Am I going to be able to commit and lean in, the better, right? And so we have this paradigm of $5, $50, $500, although with recent inflation, I think, Nikki, we may have to move it to $10, $100, $1,000. But the idea is, don't do the $500 experiment when you can do the $5 experiment first. And we use a really simplistic example. And again, I'm giving you a bit of platitudes here, but I want you to get the framework, right? A $500 experiment for understanding customer attitudes towards our little squeezable cow here, right? Might be, we're going to go do a survey monkey and we're going to recruit a sample of 500 people and we're going to send it out, or we're going to process, we're going to hire someone to analyze the data, probably more than $500, right? A $5 version might be, invite some buddies over for, all right, not quite $5, pizza, coffee, right? We'll brew them a cup of coffee and have a conversation, right? Is that $5 test sufficient to go, we're all in? Of course not, right? But you may learn things from that $5 test that'll fundamentally inform what comes next. And why not do that test first before you do the $500 test? Nick and I both know an entrepreneur from a number of years ago who had a fantastic idea for technology innovation supporting cardiac surgery, and came to one of our entrepreneurship academies. And a phenomenal scientist, really, really cool innovation, and was very interested in how to move forward. So it came to the academy. And one of our first questions to this scientist was, well, what do surgeons think about it? Well, I haven't talked to any yet. So, well, a $5 test, granted, cardiac surgeons are not easy to find, right? But, get into the hospital, sit outside the OR, all gowned up, and when they're, leaving after or whatever, grab the 5 minutes. $5 test is just find a couple and say, hey, if I were to do this, right? Would you value it? Would it help you? Would it have impact? Would you buy it, right? That fundamental question, right? That $5 question. This scientist was waiting until he had a fully built prototype and they go out and do a huge, sort of trial and everything. Turns out that there was a $5 question that could have been asked that would have answered some very fundamental discontinuities between this technology and its ability to have the impact that the innovator wanted it to have. And better to have that conversation, day 5 or day 10, when it's still a sketch, than 18 months later where you invested hard energy and effort and dollars in building a prototype, right? And then finally, our challenge to you as you think about it is, if you want to think about a challenge, right? How do you reduce the most uncertainty with the least amount of time, energy, and money invested, right? This is how you turbocharge your idea, right? Because in success, where you've spent a little bit and a relatively little amount of time to get those fundamental questions answered, right? And you've reduced your uncertainty, it positions you to move forward aggressively and be successful, okay? So as we think about this fundamental paradigm of reducing uncertainty, and I'm going to pause in a moment and we can look at questions in chat and we'll have a little conversation, right? Again, a lot of these sort of frameworks are very simple on purpose. We want you to be thinking as big bang competitors, as someone wanting to move technology forward. What's the basic framework I need to be thinking about, right? Uncertainty, psychologically, been studied for centuries, but definitely over the last 50 or 60 years really well, right? Tends to lead to inaction. If we don't know what to do, if we're uncertain, right, we don't do anything, right? And there's the whole mouse in the field Andy's so eloquent about, when it doesn't know, is there a predator there or not, it freezes, right? Not that we're mice, right? But if you can create a set of assumptions, what do I believe? What's my vision for this idea, for this technology, for the impact I want to have, right? And what are my hypotheses? People are going to value it. They're going to use it in this way. They're going to be willing to pay this. I can build the technology using this kind of material, right? By going from specific assumptions and specific hypotheses, you get into this think, do loop, right? And you actually do the experiment. And psychologically and really from a project standpoint, right? It moves you from uncertainty and inaction to action. again, a very simple chart, but I want you to really think about this, right? This idea that if you can creative assumptions, I don't know if this is going to be a useful product, right? And you have a hypothesis, but I believe people will use it to relieve stress when they're doing big bang workshops, right? And now I have an experiment. I'm going to do this, with 5 people and see what actually happens and ask them afterwards. You've moved from inaction to action. Okay. So last couple slides, then we're going to take a pause. All right. So as you think about the early stages of your company, right, creating these assumptions and hypotheses, and then thinking about what tests you would do. What's the $5 quick one? Let's get a little bit of learning, collaborate, iterate, and go to the next one, right? Across the critical challenges that you have. And you're answering the fundamental question across market, business, technology, right? For this to work, right? For this to be a viable business idea, for this to have the impact that I want it to have, what would have to be true? Right? From a very top level. And then fundamentally, a very difficult topic sometimes to grapple with, but and it's better to be specifically wrong than vaguely right. So you think about these assumptions and hypotheses, right? The more specific you are about it, and the more willing you do brutally test it and find out, was my assumption and my hypothesis, is it true or is it false? The better off you are, right? It doesn't feel good to get no and go, yeah, people don't value that, or it didn't work the way I expected it to, right? But specific no's allow you to evolve, to collaborate and iterate and move forward with your idea, or ultimately decide it's not something worth moving forward. Vague yeses like, well, I think people might like this, right? I'm pretty sure, who doesn't like a cow? Everybody likes cows, right? But without analytical data, right? Without a specific assumption, hypothesis, and test, is not very valuable. And none of us like rejection. I don't think anybody born going, yeah, I love hearing no. Yeah, more failure, the better, right? And so we have this tendency to not want to lean into getting a no. But the reality is, it's much better to be specifically wrong and learn from that wrong than to be vaguely right. Okay. All right. And then last for this section, and then I'm going to take a little break and take the questions. As you think about it, your pitch document, right, is the first $5 experiment, right? It's your prototype. And it is a $5 experiment, right? You put time into it, but at the end of the day, it's relatively inexpensive versus building the whole business. And when we think about pitching at the Institute, I'm going to put all 3 of these out, we think of 3 kinds of pitches. An elevator pitch, which is the shortest articulation of your idea. What is it for who's your target audience, that why? Why would they value this, right? It's the shortest articulation. It's your starting point for being able to have conversations about your idea. And you can use it when talking with your colleagues and when trying to share it with someone else to get feedback, right? It's probably the single most important early on tool for collaboration and iteration. And we'll talk about these just a little bit in just a moment, right? The second is the venture canvas, right? And at its core is this problem, solution, value proposition. And that's what we're going to talk on the second half of the workshop in a moment, right? It's a framework. It's not something you're likely to share with others outside of your team, but it helps you start to understand, what do I know about the market, about the technology, about the competition, about how I'm going to deliver this, what my revenue model looks like, what are the cost drivers, and then what are the milestones, team, and resources I need to be successful. It's sort of a one-pager, if you will, that kind of gets all the critical elements of how you're going to be able to move forward on one page. It's not meant to be presented. It's meant really to be a sort of a roadmap for you to understand, where do I need to lean into, what do I know and not know, and how does that direct what assumptions, hypotheses, and tests I need to make. And then finally, we're all familiar, I'm certain, with a 10-slide pitch deck. We have our version at the Institute. Y Combinator is another very common one. If you Google 10-slide pitch deck, I think last check there are about 100 trillion responses to it, or put it in ChatGPT. So we don't pretend ours is the right one and all the other ones aren't right. And ours actually has a fair degree of similarity with Y Combinator's. They're really an organization structure for you. It's your first fully comprehensive prototype, right? That talks about what your pitch is, what problem solution value proposition you have, and all the elements that we think are important to be able to articulate first for yourself. You got to be able to understand all of these things for yourself. And then it becomes a tool for you to be able to articulate, collaborate, and iterate your vision. Okay? So I'm going to spend just a moment on each of these. So our elevator pitch framework, and Nikki will drop links to each of these into the chat so you can have your very own version of them. Right? What is your offering? We think very upfront, right? When we do an elevator pitch, waiting for the, it's in journalism, it's like, don't bury the lead, right? Don't bury the lead. Tell me right up front what it is you're doing. For whom, right? Who are you serving? And it's important to be thinking about being able to articulate that in a clear way. And we'll talk about it a little bit more in a workshop next week on how do you think about customer segmentation and defining that customer, right? I will say often we hear, well, it's for everybody, right? Even if that's true, and if it isn't water, food, shelter, or air, I have some conversations with you, right? The core is who's it most valuable to? Who are you going to focus on first, right? And then the why. Why is it valuable to that customer, that target? And why is it a valuable problem to solve? Second, as I mentioned, the Venture Canvas framework, and Nikki will drop this into the chat as well. So at its core, everything you're doing should be built around a clear articulation of your problem, your solution, and your value proposition, right? And that is at the heart. If you can articulate that, it's necessary, not sufficient to move forward. So you have to start with that at the center. And then all the other things, thinking about who your customers are and what your technology is and what your market is and what it's going to cost to deliver it and what your model is to generate revenue and what resources you need and what are the milestones to move forward can build from that. But at its core, you need to focus on problem, solution, and value proposition. And then finally, the 10-slide pitch deck. And so as we think about this, I'm not going to go into it in detail given a short amount of time, but we think these are the 10 key pieces that at minimum you need to be able to articulate from your elevator pitch to problem, solution, value proposition through market, your business model, milestones, and how you're going to move forward, right? And then often we recommend two other things. One is user scenarios. So how is your target customer going to use your little squeezy cow, right? And competitive comparison, right? Show me that you've done some work in thinking about what else is out there that potentially could be a substitute for our squeezy cow. And it's candidly never appropriate to say, oh, no one's ever thought of something that substitutes for this. There is no substitute. That's a surefire sign that you haven't done your homework yet, candidly, right? Somebody is solving the problem already, right? It may not be as good as yours. It might be, there might be a lot of reasons around why you can be convinced that yours is better. But competitive comparisons, one, show that you've been thinking about positioning, right? And it shows you've really been thinking about the market. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and see what questions y'all may have for me. And these sessions are all AMA, so if you think it's may or may not be directly related to what we talked about, that's okay. Ask it. As Nikki knows, I'm not shy. Plus, I got a beard now, so
Whole new personality.
Whole new personality. Yeah. All right. Well, seeing no questions, we will then why don't we move forward with the second part of our workshop. And that is to talk about problem, solution, and value proposition. All right. So at its core, you need to start with a clear articulation of your problem. And you would be surprised how many entrepreneurs we work with start with their technology and look, I have this really cool cow. And we say, well, what problem does that cow solve? Right. And they go, well, I haven't really thought about it that way. You need to start with the problem, right? Who has it and how badly? You need to be able to articulate to me who has the lack of cow problem, right? And is it a, we say somewhat gruesomely, is it a hangnail kind of a problem? Or is it I'm bleeding from the neck and I need immediate help, or I'm in really deep trouble, right? And then how would you measure it? And I think a lot of times we think, well, I know people have this problem. Okay, well, how do you measure the problem, the impact it has, how many people have, right? The more concrete you can get about your understanding of the problem, the better. And I know a number of you thinking, well, I haven't done that research yet. I don't know the answer to that. That may be unknowable without a lot of work. That's fine. But show me that you're starting down the path of really fundamentally understanding the problem. Because if you got the problem wrong, the whole rest of what you're doing is fraught with peril, right? Because you're building a solution and a value proposition and a team and a technology and all that around this core of a problem that you're trying to solve. If you don't fundamentally understand the problem, the rest of it is scaffolding around, what I would call shaky ground, perhaps even shifting sands. Okay.
Hey, Joe,
Yeah.
we have a question in the chat for you.
No way. A question in the chat.
Can you
is
believe it? How do we decide what is important and what to cut out in the first two pitches?
How do we decide? Let me stop sharing screen so we're not like staring at a slide that has nothing to do with that question. How do we decide what's important to share and what is not important to share in an early pitch? Is that the essence of
That's the gist, yes.
Yeah. So a great question. Thank you for that question. I would say the whole point of the think, do, collaborate, and iterate is to go test that, right? And so the $5 test may be to pitch your idea to your roommate or a close friend or a friendly audience, right? That's going to give you feedback, right? And you see how it goes. And they may say, hey, I don't really understand what you're trying to do. Can you be a little more specific of what it is, right? So collaboration and iteration is really important. And think about an elevator pitch or even a 10-slide pitch deck, but let's focus on the elevator pitch. Pretty easy to turn new versions of it, right? Try one, did that work? What did I get? Give me feedback, right? And when you come to the academy, what we do is we do this exercise with everyone, and we have you pitch your pitch, and we have your colleagues, your peers listen very fundamentally for the what. Did they hear the what is it? The who the target market is, and the why. Why is it why is what you're doing important, and why is it an important problem to solve? And so as you think about sort of your assumptions, right, do those kinds of tests for yourself and present the things you think are important and get feedback. And what you're going to learn is people may not understand the idea without you saying a little bit more, or you may go so deep into the technology, they go, well, I don't really fundamentally understand the customer, or you lost me with that jargon or whatever. So think about a collaborative, iterative process. As you move forward, right, you want to progressively build it out, right? So you may start with just those core what, who, and why, but eventually you need to be able to articulate how is it going to work, right? And how is it going to serve a customer need? And how am I going to make money? Even if you're a mission-driven idea, right, you need to, if you're going to build a sustainable enterprise, you need margin as well as mission, right? And then who do I need to move forward with this on my team, as my advisors, and what are the steps I'm going to take, right? You eventually have to tell the whole story. And so what we share in the 10-slide pitch deck is a pretty comprehensive beginning to end fundamental story. But you can't tell that full story until you can tell the what, the who, and the why part of the story. Hopefully that answered your question, or a different question, maybe, Nikki, I don't know. All right, I'm going to go back to problem. And yep, we're okay on time. Okay, so what problem are you solving? Who has it and how badly, and how would you measure it, right? And, I love this quote, people don't want a 1/4-inch drill, they want a 1/4-inch hole, right? You're not buying the drill for the beauty of the drill, although those of us that like power tools might say, well, kind of cool having my little Makita here, right? you want a 1/4 inch hole. And it's interesting because I suspect many of you have heard this statement before. And when we do an academy, we have a whole conversation about this simple little statement around. So is that statement actually right? Do people really want 1/4 inch holes? And the reality is that's probably not the problem they're solving. They're not likely solving, I don't have enough 1/4 inch holes in my wall, right? That doesn't seem like a problem most people have. Some might, I don't know. I don't want to judge, but I think it's unlikely, Nikki, right? You want the 1/4 inch hole because you want to do something with that hole, right? You want to put in support pins to hang a shelf, or you want to hang a picture of grandma, or you what, right? So the problem you're solving isn't lack of holes in my wall. The problem you're solving is I need a shelf to be able to support a tchotchke, or I need a hook to be able to hang my picture of grandma. Again, a very simplistic thing, but think deeply about what problem it is that you're trying to solve. Okay. All right. Next, we're going to go to a poll. So look at me. I'm Sandra D. I am carefully shifting to poll everywhere. And we're going to go to our second poll. Okay, so love for each of you on the workshop Zoom to share a brief description, a sentence of what problem are you seeking to address, right? As you think about the innovation you're thinking about as part of Big Bang or Little Bang or just in general, right? What problem are you seeking to address? Express it as a sentence. And we don't need super secret, anything, right? It's just my problem is, I think people need to reduce their stress. And I think squeezy cows are really going to make stress in the office go away. So what problem are you seeking to address? Yours will be a million times more meaningful than that, no doubt. And sorry, pollev.com/UC Davis, or you can scan the QR code up in the top right. What problem are you seeking to address? Make gifting more meaningful and personal. Great, thank you for sharing that. What problem are you seeking to address? Sports gambling addictions, creating a less risky, more appealing alternative. Great, thank you for sharing that. What problem are you seeking to address? More time. Preventing patients from getting hospital-acquired infections. Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Personalized vaccination against cancer. Great, thank you. A little bit more time. So if you haven't been able to respond yet, give you a little bit more. Burning fossil fuel for heating. Great. Low dietary fiber intake in the US. Great, thank you for sharing that. One more moment. Thank you, everyone, for sharing those. Go back to,
And there's a couple of responses in the chat from Monica. She's on her phone, so she couldn't do the poll.
oh, okay. Do you want to read them, Nikki?
Yes, there's one, there's a breakdown of families, so she's creating a dating service. And then healthy eating for people who don't know how to cook or have no knowledge of nutrition.
Great. Great. Thank you for sharing those. Fantastic. All right, so we're going to move to the last two pieces of our triumvirate of problem, solution, and value proposition, right? So as you think about the solution, right, you want to define your work in terms of a solution to the problem that you've identified. There needs to be a very clear and tight linkage between the two, right? So that when you share the problem with me and I go, yeah, that's a problem, and you say, here's how we're going to solve it, I immediately make that connection, right? And early on, I didn't have to go into a lot of depth, but the approach that you're taking to the solving the problem has to really be tightly connected to the problem, right? Otherwise, like, what are we doing here, right? And so you want to be able to describe those primary benefits of your solution. How does it address the problem, right? Is what you want to be able to effectively articulate. And then I'm sure many of you have seen this quote before, right? This Maslow quote, to a child with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And this sort of the core idea, if we have a cool technology, right, then it can solve anything, right? So if we start from the solution side out and look for a problem to solve, it's rare that we're going to create the kind of connection that we want, right? Versus if we're starting with I've experienced this problem, I've seen this problem. We see a lot of entrepreneurs very successfully who can tell a narrative of, this problem impacted my life. Episense, the winner of the Big Bang this past year, right? Talking about the impact that epilepsy had on their families and the lack of viable ways to be able to address it was a genesis, right? Not sufficient, but a genesis for them being interested in addressing that problem, right? And so thinking about what problem it is you're going to solve and then how your solution specifically addresses solving that problem is really important. If you've got a hammer and there's a screw and you go, well, it's going to work. It may get a little ugly, but we can make it happen, right? You don't have that great connection between the problem that exists and your approach to being able to solve it, right? And then finally, the value proposition. And if we have any MBAs or business students, you're familiar with this term. Those of you that aren't, some of you may be familiar with it. It's used in a lot of different contexts, but really at its core, it's what's the most important benefit, right? How is it going to benefit the customer, your solution, right? And how would they measure it? Why would they value it, right? The more specific they can say, this is how this is going to make my life better, this is going to impact me in this way, and I can understand it, the more compelling the value of what you're trying to do is, right? And I think it's really, really important to emphasize this, that you start with the customer experience and work backward. In our academies, I use an example of Disney technology, Walt Disney World technology around photographs in the parks, and how through a series of steps, they fundamentally, ultimately got to what was going to serve their customers' best interests. But they started with we have this cool new digital technology, let's figure out what we can do with it, right? Nothing wrong with experimentation, but the challenge was they hadn't really clearly understood what problem they were solving, how their solution solved it, and why their guests at the park were going to value it. They kept missing the mark, but they collaborated, iterated, took a few years, spent a bunch of money because they're Disney, and they figured it out. And then they created this link between what they were offering and what customers really valued. And when you hit that sweet spot, that's rocket fuel, right? That's your ability to really move forward successfully with your idea. Okay. So I'm going to kind of end the presentation point, and then we can start to have a dialogue with a call to action for some key questions that I want you to be considering, right? What's it going to take for you to commit to move forward with your idea, right? And absent commitment, it's virtually impossible to move forward with something, right? And if you're not committed, it's very difficult to get customers committed, fellow, entrepreneurs committed, potential partners, funders, right? It's got to start with you, right? And if you can't get to that commitment, that probably tells you something about whether this is something, worth pursuing or not, right? So what are you going to do to figure out what it's going to take for you to commit, right? What uncertainties do you have? Early on, we have a ton, and even later on, there are a ton, right? But what uncertainties do you have that's holding you back from being able to commit, right? Think of it this way, go all the way to the end game. If you knew there was a market and a business and the technology was going to work and on and on and on, right? If you knew all that, would you be able to commit? Answer is probably yes, right? So what are the uncertainties that you've got to solve to get to that end game? And sometimes the end game looks like it's over the horizon, right? Understandable. So how do you break that down to measurable chunks, right? Starting with things you can do early on, right? What are the experiments you need to address these uncertainties, right? Think about that simple movement from inaction to action, creating an assumption, a hypothesis, and then testing, and that think, do cycle. What do I think is going on here? What experiment do I need to conduct? I go and conduct it. What did I learn from it? How do I move forward? Reducing my uncertainty and building the inherent value, right? And then ultimately being able to articulate what problem are you trying to solve? If I'd say, if I had to tell every entrepreneur I've ever met, one thing that I can say with certainty applies to everyone. Every entrepreneur is different. Every innovation is different. There's lots of shades of gray. Invest in being able to define that problem clearly. Who has it, why it's important to him, how severe it is, how you measure it, and how you measure your ability to succeed. That is the anchor that you're going to build from, right? And absent that, it's really impossible to successfully move forward. And then, of course, what's your solution to the problem, and why will customers value it? You have to be able to articulate in a succinct terms, this is why my potential customer is going to care about my little squishy cow, value it, and commit to buying the squishy cow from me. All right, so I am going to stop sharing, and we have come to the Q&A portion of our workshop. And Nikki, I am 1 minute behind schedule. That's not bad. That's not bad.
Right.
10 minutes.
That's great.
And we can stay afterwards for those of you that want to have one-on-one conversations. But I'd love, for right now, if you've got a general question that you want to ask, please do so. We love questions. Anything is fair game.
Oh, so there's one in the chat for you.
Mhm.
How do you generate convincing financial projections?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're going to have a workshop in a few weeks specifically on this. It'll go into more depth, but I'm glad to sort of take it at a top level. Our philosophy early on is to use a 3x5 approach. So for both your revenue and your costs, what are the three big drivers strategically, right? Can you articulate those to me and tell me, what are the three things that are going to really impact my ability to generate revenue? And what are the three things that are going to define what my cost structure looks like? And we often hear, well, my business is way too complicated for that. And I was like, yes. And I've seen early stage companies give me pro formas with 5 years, show me how many paper clips they're buying in year 5, when they're in the first 6 months of their idea. Number one, don't care about the paper clips right now. Number two, you can't possibly know the answer to that, right? And you're not going to know if you buy into that think, do, collaborate, iterative process, right? It's going to take a long time before you really have a firm understanding of your financials. So early on, what are the big drivers of revenue, right? What's going to enable you to start getting revenue and then scale it over time, right? And then what are the things that really impact what it's going to take to deliver whatever it is you're using, right? And then the 5 part is then show me how that's going to change over 5 years. And again, we've all seen the hockey stick chaffs where by year 3, we go from 5 customers to 500,000 customers, right? That's not what I'm talking about. It's more, what's the logic behind how things are going to evolve, right? Because that connects directly to your plan for how you're going to build something, test it, learn from it, and grow, right? And so show me your assumptions on how you're going to think about that 5-year path. And then I think the fundamental answer to your question is then once you've started down that path of understanding how you're going to make money, what are the key drivers, what's going to take to deliver what you're doing, what are the key drivers, you're going to start to iterate and get smarter about it, right? You're going to test with people that are smart about financial plans. You're going to, start understanding what does it really cost to get the unobtainium that builds my little cow here, right? And then you'll continue to evolve your model, and eventually you'll get more and more sophisticated. But it starts with can you show me you actually understand how you're going to make money, how that's going to evolve over time, what's really driving that, and what your cost structure is going to look like and how that's going to evolve. We have other
That's
questions?
great. There's another question in the chat. How do you gauge what's the best way to test out your idea to make sure there's a market?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Thank you for that. And so as you think about that, right? I'm gonna kind of go back to the workshop framework because that's why Nikki pays me the big bucks to be consistent, right? So think about that $550, $500 model, right? What's the first thing you want to know about whether there's a market, right? What's the simplest way to begin to answer that question, right? And then learning from that, how do you take that to the next level? So next week, we're going to talk in our workshop about validation, about market validation, business validation, and technology validation. And fundamental to market validation is engaging with customers. And I can't tell you how many times we'll come upon an entrepreneur. I gave you an example at the beginning of this of the medtech innovator, who was phenomenal, by the way, who we asked them a question, well, how many prospective customers have you talked to? You've been working on this for 6, 9, 12 months. And they'll say, oh, I haven't talked to any customers yet, or I don't know how to find any, or I'm uncomfortable talking to people about that. Those are all fine, right? But at the end of the day, talking to prospective customers, one first and then many, right? And think about doing it in a systematic way is going to really help you begin to understand the fundamentals of the market, right? Then there are lots of other pieces, right? Of understanding what are the competitive set out there. And I'm sure many of you are totally familiar with TAM and SAM and this idea of what's the total addressable market and, what do I specifically focus on, right? Those things, those sort of top-down things are important. To get to is this an important problem we're solving that's going to generate kind of a substantial enterprise? But it's got to start with a fundamental understanding of who my customer is she going to value my cow, right? And how do I begin to validate that first for myself and then for others? And then how do I begin to then build a plan around it? So it's really important, first and fundamental, to start on that $550, $500 progression. You may remember that simple little matrix I showed where it had, assumption, hypothesis, 550, 500, 5,000. Start charting out what you want to learn about your customer, your market, and start with the first test. And don't go overwhelmed by, my God, there's 50 things I need to know. Yeah, of course there are. Start with the first one that's most important, that you can do most quickly, right? Because if you can get into the virtuous cycle, right, then you can build momentum for yourself and for others. If you're a roadblock, then it's tough to get engagement. Other questions? And Nikki, we dropped into the chat the links to the 3 docs, right? I saw that.
Sure did.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And Nikki, let's make sure to drop your email and mine before the end of this. So if anybody has specific follow-up questions, you're welcome to reach out to either of us or really anybody at the Institute.
How do you look for financing? That's the next question.
Yeah, good question. A little beyond the scope of this workshop, but I did say AMA, so I am absolutely positively going to do my best to answer it. The short answer is it all depends, right? But we have a chart that is typically part of this presentation when we do it over the course of a day that was conveniently edited out for the purposes of doing it in an hour, that talks about sort of the stages of enterprise development and funding. So early on, we work with a lot of you who are working in a lab or, scientists or whatever, who, might be working on grants or other funding, right? Early on, you might move to an SBIR or whatever. And then typically, as you move out of the lab is when you would start looking for friends and family or angel investors in the earliest stages, then moving to professional investment, a venture fund and moving forward. And they tend to coincide with stages of, where you are. So early on, if you're working in the lab, SBIRs, and our partners at Venture Catalyst can help, sort of you define whether, there's a path forward. Are typically good ways to go because they are non-dilutive, right? They, if it's a research-based project, there's a sort of really clear path forward to being able to go after that. But typically for sort of research-oriented things like, a startup that I might work on, right? Often it's self-funded at the beginning or a friends and family. I think the important thing is to think about back to one of the early statements I made about how do you reduce uncertainty as quickly and cheaply as possible, right? So think about what things you can learn with the least amount of money early on that help you build your confidence and commitment and then be able to demonstrate that and build it to others. And so there's a one-to-one connection between I can demonstrate, I've got a clear vision, I've begun to validate that vision, and I have need for funds to continue along that path. And there's a good chance of me being able to make that work. So that's the first part of the question you asked. The second part of the question is, so how do you look for it? Really important early on to get people in your advisor camp who have some experience with financing, right? They may not be writing checks themselves, but they understand what that process is like if you're a first-time entrepreneur, who can help provide you with some guidance on, angels who might be interested in squishy cow technologies are also people that invest in squishy chicken technologies. I've got a whole range of these, Nikki. I can keep going. And squishy turtles, as it turns out, right? And so we found that, that what we ought to do is find the folks that have been investing in squishy chickens and have a conversation about our squishy cow, because we think their expertise and insights and experience in that market will make it likely they'll get what we're trying to do, and be interested in making our investment, right? So it's the old, fish where the fish are kind of thing. But early on, if you haven't gone through financing before, having somebody who has as one of your advisors is really, really important.
Great.
And then let me say one more thing about that, Nikki, sorry, which is, and also be open-minded about where financing comes from. Early on, it come from a lot of interesting places. There are grants and things like that. If you only need a small amount of money, you may go, well, hey, I want to get in the big bang and, win $10,000, $12,000 for winning a sector award. And, I'm not gonna be able to start the whole company on that. But that starts you in the virtuous cycle, right? I won the big bang social entrepreneurship, pillar. And that's helped me not just fund my early activities, but now I've got credibility to go to Nikki and say, Nikki, I won the big bang. And I've used that money to prove out these three things and demonstrate that I should be able to move forward. Let me tell you why I'd love to get you to invest in my company. And Nikki would say, you've got squishy cows and chickens. I'm not investing in your company, but someone else might say, yeah, I'm in.
Great. Let's see. Does the GSM host venture capitalists for students to network with?
Nikki, you want to answer that?
Well, I think that, they may have, I'm sorry, Joe, I don't actually
Oh, that's
know
okay.
the GSM.
So we host networking events all the time.
Oh, we do, yes.
Yeah. So GSM, I was giving us the big umbrella.
Oh, got it. Okay, I'm sorry.
So at the kickoff of the Big Bang, at the Big Bang Awards, at team formation,
Yes.
as part of the academies with mentors, we always have, as part of our mentor group, folks that do investments. And if you look at, like, if you come to one of our academies, we have usually at least one and sometimes two of our plenary pitch panelists are VCs, right? And so we have really strong ties to those communities. I think one of the things we do, just in the interest of full disclosure, find is often very early stage entrepreneurs may overestimate how ready they are to have those conversations, right? So we're a firm advocate of, go sit with someone and learn what would it take for me to be in a place to convince you to make an investment on a company, right? Early on, those are perfectly reasonable conversations to have, where you say, hey, I know I'm not there yet, but here's what I'm working on. Here are the milestones. If I come back to you having achieved this milestone of a working prototype, my first 2 customers, my whatever it might be, would you be willing to entertain an investment, right? Those are great conversations to have 6 months before you need the money, right? But if you're very early stage and you go, hey, I've got this idea and it's to do these really cool chickens and not exactly sure how I'm going to do it. I don't quite have the team yet. And, it's like, that's perfectly fine that you're at that stage, but that's not likely to be a useful conversation with someone who's a professional investor. They're going to say, come back later when, you're when you have something, or, you may end up, candidly, sort of going, that person's pretty naive. And like I say, you burned the bridge, but you certainly singed it.
Great.
Glad to answer any other questions about specific things. One from Monica.
Well, so, oh yes, so
Yeah.
how do we prepare what we need before we meet a venture capitalist?
Yeah, I think, sorry, I'm going to sound like, a bit of a broken record, right? But it's collaborate and iterate. And I don't know that you ever know that you're ready, but, they put their pants on 2 legs at a time, or whatever metaphor you want to use for them, right? So they're human beings, right? But I think you want to go in knowing that you're credible. And so if you were in a place where, like the 10-slide pitch deck that I shared, you have that pretty strongly identified what it is that we're trying to do, who our target market is, why they're going to value it, how the technology meaning the approach that we're going to deliver works, sort of what we see as our revenue model, how that's going to translate into a financial plan that's going to generate profit, right? Who we have on our team working on it now and advising us. What are our core milestones to get into the market, to begin to generate revenue, right? If you can tell that story from beginning to end credibly, then and you can then articulate, and to get to the next milestone, we need $300,000, made that number up, right? And you can demonstrate why that is and how you're going to use that money, then you're probably ready to have that conversation. But you need to be at that point, right? Where you can tell the whole story and then be clear about what the money is going to do to continue to move things forward. And I suspect you know this, but I'm going to say it just to be, in the interest of full disclosure, especially early on, you're not funding, somebody who's funding you is not funding the company. Like, they're not going to write a $5 million check and, for the next 2 years, right? They're funding a milestone typically. And the milestone might be a functional prototype that's deployed into the market that we can use with our first paying customer. I just made that one up, right? And so you need to have a clear tie between the ask and the milestone. And when you achieve that, right, I need $500,000 to build my machine that is making my cow and get it out into the marketplace and get my first 10,000 customers. And when you do that, now you've built up credibility, reduced uncertainty, built everybody's commitment. And I, as an investor, go, so what do you need next? Well, now we want to scale it. We want to go from 10,000 cows to 10 million cows, and from 2 states to 10 countries, and you built up the credibility, and that it's a progressive process. So
May I add one thing to what you're saying?
I'm sorry. Yeah.
There's also places in the region that allow you to go and watch and listen to pitches or to practice. So 1 Million Cups is a great resource for that. Then you can get familiar with what goes into a pitch and get some examples to learn from.
That's great, Nikki. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Let's see, there's a question about how to put that packet together. Do we learn how to do that in an entrepreneurship academy? Sounds like there are a lot of elements.
For the 10-slide pitch deck?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, so we try to do the building blocks in the academy. This workshop gives you some bits and pieces of it. So for example, workshop next week, we're going to talk about market, business, and technology validation. Those are three central points to, your ability to think about your venture. And then subsequent workshop, we'll talk about the finance plan and what a financial model looks like. So our goal through these workshops is to provide you with a bunch of the insights to be able to do this. And then, it's always great to have someone in your team, whether an advisor or someone who's been through this process before, if possible. It's like, hiking a new trail. It's great if you have a guide who's done it. It's not necessary. You can do it without the guide, but it's always helpful. Whether that's a mentor who's giving you feedback, which we would strongly encourage you to do, and we can help connect you with mentors, or somebody on your team who said, yeah, I competed in Big Bang last year or Little Bang last year, and I've been through this. And so I know a little bit about what it takes. That just is, it's sort of a 101 kind of thing. But yeah, the academies, we take 3.5 days and we go into kind of more depth than we can in a series of 6, 7 1-hour workshops. But the workshops give you a pretty good insight, frankly.
Yeah. All right, I believe that's all the questions that I've seen here. I just wanted to mention a couple of deadlines, if I may, to
Please.
the Little Bang registration date is coming up on February 6th. So if you'd like to practice before registering for the Big Bang and create a poster and do a pitch, registration for that is February 6th. And then the Big Bang, of course, round 1 launches on March 3rd. So make sure you don't miss that deadline because that round starts off the competition and then the subsequent rounds go from there.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining. I hope you have a lovely Wednesday and look forward to seeing you next week. Our workshop will start at noon. It'll be focused on market, business, and technology validation. And we have a fantastic guest entrepreneur who's going to take the frameworks that we apply and is actually going to talk about how it works in the real world. And she happens to be the winner of the 2018 Big Bang. So she will speak from experience for sure. All right.
Great. Thank you all for being here. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.